Hope everybody's doing well tonight. We are at the fourth gospel in our study according to and talking about each of these gospels' different perspectives. So tonight will be our last night with this particular format with the gospels. I hope that it's been fun and enjoyable to kind of think about them as a whole. Typically, like I said at the beginning of our little study, we focus in on individual passages and maybe even spend months and months studying each gospel, but rarely do we think about the gospel from cover to cover in one sitting. And so that's what I've been hoping for us to get to do over the last couple of weeks with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and now this week with John. I want to reiterate what I've been starting each of our lessons with, just because I think it kind of provides a little bit of context for us as well as we enter into this, which is each of the four gospel writers tell the story of Jesus in their own unique way, and they tell us what matters to them and how the story changed them. And so by reading each of the four different accounts, we kind of get a little bit of a different version of the same story from a different perspective. So according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so today we get the most different version of the gospel compared to the other three. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic gospels, which just means that they're very similar. They're kind of like the same look to them. But John does not get included in that list because John is very different. But he's at the same time telling the same story. He's telling the story of Jesus. And so I also wanted to include a couple of statements just to remind us that even though they're all telling the story in their own way, they're still telling the same story. And so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all include so much in common with them. But the very basics of that we can boil it down to maybe just a couple of sentences is that, number one, God came in the flesh as a man to be with us. And boy, does John emphasize that one, right? So number one, God came in the flesh as a man to be with us. He died, but he was also raised back to life. And somehow his death and resurrection saved us from our sin. And so all of the Gospels, that's the story they're telling. But they're going to tell it differently. And they're going to talk about events in Jesus' life and different moments that he encounters and interacts with different people and how it changes everybody who's involved. And I love that, too, because for us, what I think that means is that the four Gospels give us permission to understand that Jesus is going to change us in a different way than maybe the person that we're sitting next to or that we're sitting across the room from. And so how Jesus interacts with me is going to be different than how Jesus interacts with you. But it's the same Jesus. And he does the same thing for all of us. He saves us from our sin through his death and resurrection. And so I love that idea because we all have a chance to share the gospel. That's what we've been commissioned to do by Jesus, is to share the gospel. And that means that how I tell it is going to be a little bit different than how you tell it. But it's going to include these kinds of things, right? And so I love that idea and want to make sure that we always talk about that whenever we talk about these different gospel accounts. Okay, I gave us homework, which was to read the Gospel of John, if you could, in one sitting from cover to cover. If not in one sitting, then just to read it before class tonight. So for those who read it or for those who are just familiar with it, what stands out to you about the Gospel of John? What makes the Gospel of John unique when you read it or when you read it maybe this last week? Mike.
John 3:16.
Okay, John 3:16, yeah. Probably the most well-known verse in the whole Bible, right? John 3:16. And so, yeah, that stands out, doesn't it? That's good, good. What else? Yeah, Ellison.
So one thing I had noticed this time was the number of references to the amount of times that Jesus was going up to observe one of the feasts.
Yes.
Like, we know how in the Old Testament they were commanded to go up to Jerusalem 3 times a year. But then this time I happened to particularly notice how many times it said it was like celebrating the Passover. And then I think it's just a good reminder that he had to observe the law perfectly so that he can completely fulfill unblemished sacrifice for our sins, and that he had to do all those things that was written in the Old Testament. He had to live.
That's good. That's good. Yeah. I would say. So in case you didn't hear what Ellison said, John is really intent on telling us about the story of Jesus surrounding the Jewish festivals and these pilgrimage feasts where they go to Jerusalem. And I would even say that there's others included, but John has a particular emphasis on these 3 Passovers that all happen. Jesus goes to the Passover, and then this happens. Jesus goes to the second Passover, and then this happens. And then the third Passover, of course, is the Passion story, when he is the sacrifice. He's crucified as the sacrifice. But there are the other festivals and feasts are included in John as well. And it's a focus that John has throughout the gospel. So that's great. Thank you, Ellison. Yeah, good. What else stands out about John's gospel? Yeah, Philip.
The beginning is a very beautiful way to start it. In the beginning was the Word, the Word was with God, the Word was God.
Yeah. His beginning is unique. We talked about this when we talked about Mark. Matthew and Luke start with the birth account and with genealogies. Mark just dives right in to Jesus' ministry. And John goes all the way back to the beginning of time and says, hey, Jesus was there even then. He was a part of creation, the creation event itself. And so, yeah, it's a very unique, poetic, beautiful passage that describes and talks about who Jesus was in the beginning of time. So, good. What else? Randy?
I was initially drawn to the Gospel of John because of his use of light and darkness as describing Jesus obviously is light and his followers are to walk in the light, and the darkness is that which is not Jesus.
That's right. Go ahead.
No,
Okay.
That's just, for me, that's a simile that works for me, that really tells the story to me.
Yeah. John has these themes that he weaves all the way through the gospel. Light and darkness is one of the big ones. Water and how water plays a role in purification and things like that. Life, these are huge themes in the Gospel of John that he's going to weave in and out of a lot of different stories. Anything else? What stands out about the Gospel of John to you? John?
Well, he's big on completeness. Brought up, Phil, I didn't remember your name, sorry. Phil brought up about the beginning, creation. John uses that, and the Jews were fond of the number 7, and he gives all these instances on where trying to press that Jesus did come to complete his mission. And this is what it was for.
Yeah.
He makes a very convincing argument.
Yeah, that's right. Completeness, that's good. There's a quote, Rick, you may know, I think it's Augustine. There's two different ways to say his name. I always say Augustine. I don't know if that's right or not. But I think it was originally one of his. I'm not sure. But he talked about how the Gospel of John is shallow enough that a child can wade into it and deep enough that an elephant can swim in it. And that completeness idea stands out to me because you could read the Gospel of John just at a very surface level and be like, oh, this is nice. This is very beautiful language at the beginning, like Philip was talking about, where in the beginning was the Word, and you can get something from it just by doing kind of an easy read of it. But you can spend a lot of time and get into the festivals and the feasts and talk about how Jesus completes these different things, and it really can be a very deep study when you do that. Was that an Augustine? Do you know? Was that his quote?
It seems like that's right. I've
Okay.
heard the quote. That does seem right.
Yeah. So don't quote me on who I quoted. Right? Somebody said it in history, and I'm going to give it to Augustine. Okay, good. Anything else?
I like the unique stories and they're like almost a chapter dedicated to those stories early on. Like you've got chapter 2 with the changing of the water to wine. You got chapter 3 with Nicodemus. Chapter 4 with the woman at the well. Chapter 6 with. There's just these long stories that are unique to John.
Yeah. When you think, in just a second, I'm going to tell you what's unique about John. And usually I have a couple things to share with you, 2 or 3 things. With John, you could do the whole book just about. Almost the whole book is unique. There's stories that John tells that the other gospel writers don't tell. The water turning into wine, Jesus' encounter with Nicodemus, the Samaritan woman at the well. I mean, just over and over again, we get these stories that are unique to John. He's the only one who tells about these events in Jesus' ministry. But yeah, they get these lengthy sections where John can really dive deep. Mark is giving us the quick facts, right? Jesus did this, he went here, he did that.
Five verses where John's a whole chapter.
That's right, yeah. And so John's going to take his time with these events. And a lot of times the stories, they kind of play off one another also. So like in chapter 3, you get Nicodemus, this religious leader that's coming to Jesus at night, going back to the light and darkness theme that Randy brought up. Nicodemus, who's this teacher of the Israelites, he comes at night to ask Jesus a question. And the next day, or not necessarily the next day, but the next chapter, you get a Samaritan woman in the middle of the day at noon who is having this conversation and asking Jesus questions. And so they're meant to be kind of like foils of one another, right? And they're meant to kind of be compared to each other in some instances. But yeah, I love that, the way that John's a storyteller. I mean, they're all storytellers, but John's a storyteller as well. So good.
Makes you wonder how he knew about all those things.
Yeah.
Curious about.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting, and this begins to show up later on, kind of going off of Mike's comment, how did John know these things? John includes, as the gospel goes along, this disciple whom Jesus loved, right? And so there's kind of two main options. Number one is that it's the disciple John, and the other option is that it's a different disciple, also named John, who ends up writing the gospel event, but who was a follower of Jesus. And so he shows up later in the story identifying himself as the disciple who Jesus loved. And so it's kind of interesting to think about this guy following Jesus around, whether it's the apostle John or a different guy named John. John, nonetheless, is telling his encounter with Jesus. Yeah. We talked about John 3:16 as this incredibly well-known verse all over the world, but maybe John 1:14 should be, if we were going to know a verse from the Gospel of John, maybe it should be John 1:14. John 3:16 is pretty good too. It's hard to turn that one down.
3:17 gets shortchanged.
Yeah, that's true.
If you know 3:16, you need to know 17.
Yeah. And I'm going to throw out another verse too that's important in just a minute that no one ever picks from the Gospel of John, because they always go to 3:16, but there's another one too that's worth knowing as well. Doug.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't say this from an academic perspective, but I think that John is the most resistant to simple translation. I guess that's the best way I can put it. I had a hard time reading it because I just kept wanting to go back and read the first 18 verses of chapter 1.
Yeah.
I couldn't, I just kept going back to that.
Yeah.
And you start digging into that, and it's just fascinating.
Yeah. And over again, one of the things that I noticed that I felt like this particular reading for me, that I think is kind of what Doug is talking about too. There was large sections that felt almost like a courtroom drama, right? Where you're reading a transcript of here's what the defense attorney said, and then here's what the prosecuting attorney said, and it's back and forth between Jesus and the religious leaders, all about who he is, and it's this incredibly in-depth. Jesus is speaking in very complex terms, but trying to communicate a very simple idea. The Father and I are one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And just over and over again, he says that, and then they accuse him or ask him a question. How can you think that? How can you say that? That's blasphemy, and back and forth you go. And so to me, it felt like a courtroom drama almost of trying to read, okay, goodness, trying to understand what goes on in court. That takes a lot to unpack.
Even just the concept of logos is just,
Yeah.
I mean, it's easy to just say the word, and I think, at least growing up, I think most of us, at least initially in our minds, we may not know it's exactly right, just the Bible, right, or the word, but that's not what it means at all. And you start digging into it, and it just becomes fascinating.
Yeah.
That's the word.
Yeah, John is very, along with that, I would say that John is very image-oriented. He wants to give you an image to think about, to picture. Jesus says, I am the light of the world, right? Okay, I'm picturing that in my mind. Okay, I am the gate. Okay, I'm picturing that. He gives us these images of who Jesus is that take a lot of reflection and thinking about, okay, what does that mean? And okay, if he's the gate, what does that mean about these other things too? So, good. Any final things that stand out to us about John? I'm gonna dive into a lot more here in just a second, but I want to give you guys a chance to throw anything else out. Okay, let me just kind of point out a handful of things that didn't get mentioned yet that are really interesting. Like I said, if I was going to talk about things that are unique to John's gospel, like just start at chapter 1, verse 1, and just kind of start verse by verse, just about going through the gospel. But a couple things to point out to us. Number one, John is going to use time differently in his gospel than what we're accustomed to with the other gospels. So Rick pointed out in chapter 2, for example, we get the story of Jesus turning water into wine. Immediately after that story, Jesus is going to be in the temple turning over the tables. And in the other three gospels, that happens in the final week of Jesus' life. In John's gospel, it happens in the second chapter. And so John is using time differently to help us understand the story of Jesus. And so, I think a lot of times people say that John's the one who's out of order. If we're going, chronologically, John would say that he's in the right order, I think, right? So perhaps that's something to keep in mind too as we read through this. And a lot of it has to do with what Ellison pointed out, that it's the events in John are centered around these Passover feasts and the festivals of Israel. In John's gospel, there is no parables, nor are there any miracles. And so in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that's one of the primary ways that they tell the story is through the parables of Jesus and the miracle stories that show the power that Jesus has. In John, there are signs, right? And so the signs can be miraculous. Often, I think they all are. They're all miraculous. But they're not miracles in the sense of showing the power of Jesus. They're meant to point to the identity of Jesus. They're meant to show us who he is. And so John talks about signs. There's so many stories that are unique to John's gospel that don't get told in the other gospels. One of my favorites that I'm going to pick out and just mention to us is the feet washing scene in John 13. Again, I mean, just like Rick said, you could almost go chapter by chapter and get a new story that John tells the other gospels don't. But that foot washing scene is so significant in John's gospel. And really kind of helps to provide a turning point in John's gospel from the first half into the second half of the gospel. I love this too. At the end of the gospel, rather than Jesus being killed, he gives up his life. And I think that's important. I think that's significant for John. In this gospel, Jesus does not get killed. He gives his life up. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Romans kill Jesus. But in John, Jesus gives up his life. Anyways, I think that's significant to John. I've got a couple of verses to show you this one too, but John is going to heavily, heavily emphasize that there is a special relationship between Jesus, the Son, and God the Father. So, I mean, you could read all over the gospel and see this. Here's just two. John 5:19 and 20. Jesus, talking to the religious leader, says, "Very truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. For the Father loves the Son and shows all he does." So there's a special relationship between the Father and the Son. And then in John 10, he gets even more overt, and he just says, "The Father and I are one." Right? And so that the religious leaders, when they hear that, they think, blasphemy. We've got to kill this guy. But this is what John wants to highlight, that Jesus is always drawing attention to this special relationship that he has to the Father. We talked about there being no miracles, but there are signs. I think it was John who mentioned that the number 7 is really significant. So the number 7 shows up all over the Gospel of John. There are 7 signs. There's some debate about which of the 7 events that Jesus does in John are the 7 signs. So there's one that kind of gets, is this an addendum to a sign? So when Jesus feeds the 5,000, then he goes and walks on the water, and that's the one that people wonder, is that a sign or is that an addendum to the feeding of the 5,000? And if you add it as an addendum to the 5,000, then Jesus' death and resurrection is the 7th sign. If it's its own sign, then Lazarus' death and resurrection is the 7th sign. So there's some debate about what the ordering of the signs should be. But there's 7 signs. There's also 2 different sets of 7 I am statements. right? So you guys know, especially the I am the fill in the blank I am statements. I am the light of the world. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. I'm the gate. I'm the good shepherd. There's 7 of those. But there's also 7 I am statements where he just says I am, which is the Greek translation of the name of God, right? And so when he says this, oftentimes people back away because they're expecting lightning to strike and for Jesus to get cut down and killed, because he's essentially saying he is God in that moment. And so there's some expectation that Jesus is about to get in trouble, but it doesn't happen. And so he says 7 times, I am. So again, the number 7 is important. At the end of the gospel, there's also this interesting, Jesus will speak with Pilate during his trial. In the other gospels, the only thing that Jesus says is, that's what you said. Are you the king of the Jews? That's what you said. But in John, he has a back and forth with Pilate, and he reasons with Pilate, and he talks with Pilate. And so John's the only one that includes a conversation during his trial at that moment. One of my favorite unique aspects of the Gospel of John is that he is a really bad secret keeper. John does not keep secrets well. And so if you were reading John for the first time and you had no idea what this story was about, he ruins the plot in the 2nd chapter. He tells you what's going to happen at the end in chapter 2. And so chapter 2, verse 22, John gives away the death and resurrection of Jesus, just gives it away. He's not holding on to it. He's not waiting for the climax of the story. If he was taking a modern storytelling class, he would fail because the climax comes in chapter 2, and then you still have 19 more chapters to tell after that. But chapter 2:22 says, and he was raised from the dead, and his disciples recalled what he had said, and they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken to him. So again, if you're reading it for the first time, you think, when he raises from the dead, that hasn't happened. How's that going to happen? And so he's a terrible secret keeper. He talks about John the Baptist being imprisoned and killed before it happens in chapter 3, verse 24. In chapter 6, verse 71, he talks about Judas betraying Jesus well before we get there. So again, he's not a very good secret keeper. He thinks his audience already knows the story, and so that's why he includes these notes early. And so I always think that's kind of interesting as well. I wanted to point this out too. In Mark's gospel, we talked about how the wrong people keep identifying who Jesus is. The people who should know, should recognize who Jesus is, they can't figure it out, but everybody who's wrong immediately identifies who he is. In John's gospel, it's not that the wrong people understand who Jesus is, but he keeps being identified. John is always putting that before us, that the identity of Jesus. So he gets titles from different people. I've got a slide with like kind of 6 different examples of this. In chapter 1, Nathanael, one of his followers, calls him the Son of God, the King of Israel. In chapter 4, after the encounter with the woman at the well, the Samaritan people identify him as the Savior of the world. In chapter 6 and 7, the crowds identify him as the Messiah or a prophet, the prophet. Chapter 6, the disciples call him the Holy One of God. In chapter 11, Martha, the sister of Lazarus, says that he's the Messiah, the Son of God. And then at the very end, doubting Thomas, poor Thomas, he gives the great declaration. Doubting Thomas gives the greatest declaration in the gospel. You are my Lord and my God. And so Thomas needs to get a little bit more credit sometimes than he gets from us. But he gives the big final announcement there at the end, my Lord and my God. Okay, I told you John 3:16 and 17 are very well known. John 1:14 maybe should be really well known. Another verse that ought to be on the tip of our tongues when we think about the Gospel of John that no one ever picks. John chapter 30, verse 31. It says, "These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." With the other Gospels, I tried to tell you in my own words what that Gospel was about. With John's Gospel, I don't have to do that because John tells us exactly what his Gospel is about. It's that we will know who Jesus is and that we will have life because of him. And so that's what John's Gospel is all about. Everything is pointing to that in this Gospel. Okay, I want to spend the rest of our time digging in a little bit to talk about what that life looks like. We've got 15, maybe 20 minutes, depending on how long y'all will listen to me talk tonight. But before I dive into any of that, any comments? I mean, I just covered a lot of things that are kind of unique to John's gospel or interesting about his gospel. Any comments or reactions to any of those before we dive into what does this life that John's trying to get us to understand look like? Reactions, comments? Okay, there's a lot more we could have covered. So just be glad that it was only about 7 minutes. Okay, let's turn to John 1 and look at that chapter, that opening scene in the gospel. We could spend a long time, we won't, but we could spend a long time reflecting on this set of 18 verses. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, and the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified concerning him. He cried out, saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me, because he was before me.' Out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known." So this is how John opens his gospel, and he wants to draw our attention back to Genesis, back to this story that God's people have from the beginning of history, the beginning of time. But John especially wants to identify who Jesus is in that. That this is not something that is made up. It's not something that's new. It's actually something that has been from the very beginning. Jesus is not somebody that we can ignore because he's a pretender, he's a blasphemer, he's fake, he's false. John says, nope, he was there in the beginning. He was present. He's the reason for everything. So going back to that word logos, the word that we translate as the word, it means logic, it means reason. He's the reason that all of this exists is because of Jesus. And so John wants us to remember that, and he's going to spend the rest of the gospel trying to help us understand that if we don't know Jesus, we really don't know all that much about anything. And so he talks about in him was life, and that life is illuminated by the light because the world is in darkness. And without the light, we don't know much of anything at all. I'm at that age, that stage of life where if I walk through my house in the dark, chances are I'm going to step on something that's going to hurt, and I'm going to really hope and pray that none of my church members along with me hear any of the words that come out of my mouth. In the darkness, you don't know anything, right? But with the light, you can know. And the light comes, and it brings us life. And the only way that we know and have life and have light is because of Jesus, is because of the Word, the reason for it all. So John's going to spend his whole gospel talking about how this Jesus brings light and brings life, and that if we don't know him, we don't know much of anything else at all. I'm going to share with you a couple more passages here tonight that I think will highlight this and identify this even more in John's gospel. But before I do, there's so much that we could unpack in this first 18 verses. So, I mean, somebody help me out here. If I do it all by myself, I'm going to leave a lot out. I'm going to miss things that are important. So somebody help me out. When you read these 18 verses, what do you hear? What do you hear John saying to us about Jesus? You have to know him. Yeah. Yeah. You have to know him. Yeah.
It's the beginning of his march through the whole gospel of revealing himself to be God, but that's so that because we haven't seen God, no one has ever seen God, but he's revealing himself to be God so that people can see him, and knowing people need to see something and touch something and hear something, that he's beginning to let people know that they can see God because they can see him.
Yeah. Yeah. There's
and then what he is and who he is begins to be revealed and continues throughout the rest of the chapter.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a preacher, I think I've quoted this before, I'm not sure if it was in a class or in a sermon, but there's a preacher who talks about this idea of the revelation of Jesus over the course of his ministry, and as people identify who he is. And the quote goes something like this. It's God is like Jesus. We haven't always known that, but now we do. Right? And so if you think about who is God, well, he's like Jesus. We didn't always know who Jesus was, but now we do. And so now because we see Jesus, we see God. And so it's a pretty good quote, I think. I like it. There's probably flaws in it, too. Every quote has flaws, right? Anyways, I like that. I like that idea a lot. Good. Anything else?
Well, it's the theology of the person of Jesus. It's the sub-thread throughout the entire book.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, John's gospel is all about Christ. Who is this Christ? In theology terms, it's Christology. John's gospel is Christology, right? He's not doing what does the church look like. He's not doing what does that mean for salvation. He's doing who is Jesus. That's the question that John's trying to answer. And the answer he gives in chapter 20 that I showed you earlier is that he is life. That he is life. Good. What else? Anything? Yeah.
You know, it always amazes me, you talk to people and they say, you give yourself too much grace. I want the truth, you know. And one passage right here, we have the total answer.
Yeah.
They're together.
That's right. Yeah.
That's probably my favorite part of this.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I love this too. This idea in the slide right before this, the words right before the law was given through Moses, is it talks about how we've received grace on top of grace already given, right? So John refers to the law of Moses as grace already given, which is an interesting, when you think in New Testament terms, Paul's not going to refer to the law of Moses as a grace. He's going to refer to it as more of a burden that's been placed upon us, right? But John calls it a grace, and then he says Jesus is grace on top of grace. And he is grace and he is truth. And so, that is a great, verses 17 and 18 are really powerful when we think about that as well. That's good. Okay, let me show you a couple more verses that I think highlight. John here is talking about because the Word came in the flesh, we can have life, right? I think we can get that out of these 18 verses. He's going to talk about a couple of other things that we need to think about. He's going to quote Jesus in a couple of other places, talking about how do we find this life that Jesus has come to offer us. And so in chapter 5, he's having a debate with the religious leaders, as he often does in John. And in verse 39, Jesus says, "You study the scriptures diligently because you think that in them you have eternal life. These are the very scriptures that testify about me, yet you refuse to come to me to have life." This is, for me, this is a very hard word because we don't have Jesus in the flesh in front of us. What we have is what Doug mentioned earlier that we often call the Word, right? And what John is highlighting when he quotes this teaching from Jesus is that they search this diligently looking for life. And the only way that life is in these pages is if that life is pointing to the person of Jesus. And so if we read this and somehow don't come to the person of Jesus, we do not have life. We have law, and we have structure, And sometimes we have chains. And if we don't have Jesus, we don't have life. And Jesus makes that point very clear. Of course, he's talking in this passage about the Old Testament, right? So it's a little bit of a different, it's not the full story that we have in front of us. But I think it's a hard word. I think it's a hard word, and it's a word that I'm challenged by on a regular basis, that don't get so enamored with this that I forget who it's about. Because if I don't know who it's about, I don't have life. I just have a book. Does that make sense? I respect the book. I love the book. But the book is about a person, the person of Jesus. John 17:3. Jesus is praying for his disciples. He's praying for the whole world. This is just a couple chapters before his crucifixion. And Jesus says, "This is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent." So Jesus is praying, and he says, that's how you have life. You come to know God. And how do you come to know God? You know Jesus. And so when it comes to John trying to tell us about this life that has come into the world that is available to us, the only way that we can have that life is if we know who Jesus is. And Jesus is going to give his life so that we can have life ourselves. Knowing about the law and knowing how to follow God are good, but they are not a substitute for God in the flesh, for the person of Jesus. I don't know if as you were reading the Gospel of John, if you noticed that it pretty neatly divides into almost two different halves. You get these first 11 chapters. People call the first 11 chapters the book of signs because that's where the majority of these signs that Jesus performs happen. And they're meant to reveal the identity of Jesus to us. We keep having this debate in the first 11 chapters about Jesus telling the religious leaders that he and the Father have this special relationship and that he and the Father are one. And then in chapter 12, things begin to shift, and they call chapters 12 through 20 the book of glory because this is the Passion Week. This is the last week of Jesus' life. And I think it's a really good metaphor almost for the rest of the New Testament. Because what happens in chapters 1 through 11 is Jesus is trying to tell you who he is. And then all of a sudden in chapter 12, it shifts, and now Jesus is trying to tell you what you ought to do as a result of who he is. And so in chapter 13, you get that famous foot washing scene, and he tells them to do for one another as he's doing for them. In chapter 13, he tells them that there's no greater love than to lay down your life for your friends, and he's going to do that for them in a couple chapters. In chapter 17, he offers this prayer for unity for the believers and for the entire world that God has created. And so he's inviting them, if you know who I am, chapters 1 through 11, chapters 12 through 20, now you have a responsibility to follow me and to do the things that I've taught you and told you how to do these things. And so you're going to serve one another. You're going to wash each other's feet. You're going to lay down your life for each other. You're going to love one another. And it's almost like this is what we get the four Gospels in the first half of the New Testament. I'm using half metaphorically, right? We get the four Gospels, and they're telling us about who Jesus is, and then we get the rest of the New Testament that's telling us now what do we do as a result of who Jesus is. And John's Gospel, I think, is almost divided in the same way that, hey, John's trying to tell us who Jesus is. Jesus keeps telling us who he is. And now, because you know Jesus, these are the kinds of things that you need to do. So Matthew's Gospel, if I was to summarize how that happens, Matthew's Gospel says that you obey his commands. If you want to be Jesus' follower, you obey his commands. In Mark's Gospel, if you want to be a follower of Jesus, you make Jesus your king. He's the king that you follow. In Luke's Gospel, if you want to be a follower of Jesus, you serve the people that nobody else is serving in the name of Jesus. And in John's Gospel, if you want to be a follower of Jesus, you love like he does. You show your love the way that Jesus has shown love to you. John says that the Word became flesh and he came to be among us, and it was so important for God to do that he died for us, that he gave his life so that we could have life ourselves. And so John introduces Jesus to us, and he says, if you know him, you'll have life. If you don't know him, you won't. And so when we come to the end of John's Gospel, he has that line. He says, the reason he's written his gospel so that you may believe that Jesus is the Son of God, the Messiah, and so that you may come to have life in his name. As we've been going through these Gospels, I hope that you have enjoyed reading them, studying them, thinking about them. But I hope in the back of your mind, maybe, that you've also been thinking about, how do I tell the story of Jesus? These are the Gospels according to these four authors. What's the Gospel according to me? How am I going to tell people about the story of Jesus? I think there's some things you've got to include in the story, but you've also got a unique perspective and a unique way of telling other people how Jesus has changed you and what it is about him that you love and that you seek to follow him with your life and why. So I hope that's been in the background of your mind as well, because I think the world needs to know that they can have life through Jesus. There's all kinds of opportunities for people to seek life in so many different ways, and usually the things that we seek do not bring us life. They bring us closer to death. But Jesus will bring us closer to life. So that's my encouragement to us tonight, is to seek life, and the way to do that is to know Jesus and to follow him by loving as he loves. Final comments, questions, things that are important in John's gospel for us tonight.
John, that Jesus mentions that he's gone back to heaven to build.
In John 14, I think is maybe what you're talking about. In John 14, he says that he's going to prepare a place for us. So the beginning of John 14, before he says that he's the way, the truth, and the life. That's right. Yeah, good.
I was just going to say, I think John 10:10 has been a powerful verse in my own life, and coming up with what you were just saying about life, that the thief has come and continues to come to steal, to kill, and to destroy, not our bodies, but our faith. But Jesus said, I've come that you have life in abundance.
Yeah, that's right.
In my old Bible, not the one I carry right now, probably 2 ago, I have written, even when, even if, we can have abundant life in Jesus.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah, that's great. I want to let you know what's coming the next couple of weeks. That way you can decide whether you want to be here or not. I thought, on October the 9th, we're going to have a prayer night. We did this last year around this time of year. We had a prayer night where we had a night that was kind of focused on praying together. And so we're going to do that on October the 9th. But we have 2 Wednesdays before that. And so those 2 Wednesdays, we're going to do something a little bit out of the box, or maybe not out of the box. But we're going to look at the life of Jonathan in the Old Testament. Jonathan, the son of King Saul. One story, very well known, of how Jonathan saves David's life from his father. And then next week, we'll look at a less well-known story about Jonathan. Bizarre story. I was working on the lesson today. It's a bizarre story, but I love it. It's a great story. So we're going to look at the life of Jonathan for 2 weeks, 2 different stories from him, and draw some lessons from that. And then we'll have that prayer night on the 9th. I really encourage you to be here on the 9th. If you have people that don't typically come on Wednesdays that you're close to, encourage them to be here on the 9th. I think that's always a really good thing for us to do as a body together, is to join together in prayer. So we're looking forward to that night. The teens will be with us. The men's and ladies class, I think, are going to join us as well. So we'll be all together that night for a night of prayer in here. But that's what's coming up next. So look forward to that. And then after that, I'll tell you next week what's coming after that. But until then, just look forward to Jonathan. Okay, let me invite Russ to close us with prayer tonight, and then we'll be dismissed.
Father God, we are so thankful to be here tonight. It's been such a privilege to hear what your servant John said about your son. And Father, I ask that each of us this week spend a serious amount of time considering his life and considering how he reflected you. And in that regard, Father, help us to consider how we can reflect him in this world and in his community. The love he showed and the life he offered and the salvation he brought through his blood. And we thank you so much for that, Father, in words we cannot even express. It's been great to be here tonight. Thank you for allowing us to be here tonight. In your son's holy name we pray. Amen.